It's a nation literally split in two by the sea, where face is treated as a social currency, and the caves are large enough to swallow a skyscraper. Those aren't even the best parts. So today we're diving into the colourful, high-tech evolution of Malaysia. Alright, so around 10,000 BC, the first wave of people, called the Proto-Malays, began migrating from southwest China, spreading across the peninsula, into Sumatra, Borneo, and even parts of the Philippines. Then, around 300 BC, a second wave of migrants showed up. This time they were called the Deutero Malays. Apparently they descended partly from the Cham people of the Mekong Delta. Because of that, they pushed the earlier settlers further inland to become the direct ancestors of the Malay people we know today. Right around the same time, give or take 100 BC, trade routes started humming. So, ships from China and India began docking along the Malay coast. And suddenly this peninsula wasn't a jungle anymore. It became a crossroads. A crossroad for religion like Buddhism and Hinduism, which came from India. A crossroad for writing like Sanskrit. Basically, this entire region started absorbing cultures like a sponge. So it's no surprise that between the 7th and 13th centuries, much of the Malay peninsula fell under the influence of the Srivijaya Empire, a massive, trade-obsessed maritime empire based in Sumatra. Then, around 1400 to 1402, a renegade Sumatran prince named Iskandar Shah, who, by the way, claimed to be a descendant of Alexander the Great, founded the port city of Malacca on the southwestern coast of the peninsula. From there, it was a domino effect. He converted to Islam. Word spread. Then Muslim merchants flocked in. Within decades, Malacca became the most important trading hub in Southeast Asia. Like, we're talking 15,000 merchants from across the known world. Chinese, Arab, Persian, Indian, all crammed into one port city. And what were they selling? Indonesian spices, Malay gold, Chinese silk, you name it. Oh, and Islam. It started spreading rapidly across the region too, carried by merchants and embraced by the Malay elite. So yeah, it was around this period that the Malay identity started crystallizing. Basically, if you spoke Malay and practiced Islam, you were technically a Malay. Simple as that. But sad to say, that golden age didn't last forever. Come 1511, the Portuguese, who'd been hunting for a sea route to Asia for a century, showed up with warships and cannons. Eventually, Admiral Afonso de Albuquerque captured Malacca and claimed it for Portugal. And just like that, the first European colonial chapter in Malaysia began. But guess what? The Portuguese kind of bungled it with high taxes and religious intolerance. So the merchants left, and Malacca never really recovered its former glory for a really long time. In 1641, the Dutch East India Company swept in, allied with local powers, and kicked the Portuguese out. Naturally, the Dutch tried to revive the city's trade, and let's just say they kind of failed at that too. Then the British arrived in the late 1700s. At the time, Britain was deep into its China trade and needed a foothold in Southeast Asia. So let me give you a rundown of just what happened. In 1786, they leased the island of Penang from the Sultan of Kedah. In 1819, Stamford Raffles planted Britain's flag on a little island at the southern tip of the peninsula called Singapore. And by 1824, they were able to get Malacca too. Eventually, they bundled Penang, Malacca and Singapore together as the Strait Settlements. From there, the British influence crept across the entire peninsula, one sultanate at a time. By the early 1900s, the British practically controlled all 9 Malay sultanates, all while tin mining and rubber plantations were making the region enormously profitable. Because these industries were so successful, they needed more manpower to handle the demands. That's when waves of Chinese and Indian immigrants arrived, transforming the population completely. As a result, ethnic communities developed separately, though side by side. And that tension? Well, that's going to matter a whole lot later. For now, let's jump into 1941. Let me paint you a picture. Japan was bombing Singapore and the northern coast of Malaya, so Singapore, which was supposedly Britain's impenetrable fortress in Asia, fell in February 1942. And that marks the end of British control, but that was far from over, because within the next 3 years, Japanese occupation stripped the country of its resources, inflaming ethnic tensions between Malays, Chinese and Indians, which led to the massacre of thousands of ethnic Chinese across Malaya and Singapore. Japan called it sukching, which in English essentially means purge through purification. Then, when the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, British forces returned. But the Malaysia that emerged from World War II was fundamentally different from what we've learned about it so far. They were scarred, and they were more than ready to tackle this very important question. Why are we still a colony? Well, after World War II, Britain was pretty exhausted, and slowly it was loosening its grip on its colonies. Eventually, through peaceful negotiations, the Federation of Malaya gained its independence on August 31st, 1957. 6 years later, in 1963, Sabah, Sarawak and Singapore joined to form what we now know as Malaysia. Though 2 years later, in 1965, Singapore was expelled, and in 1969, there were deadly riots that shook Kuala Lumpur. The country steadied itself and began the long work of figuring out what it actually meant to be Malaysian. And truly, I get where they're coming from, because when you look at a map, you'll see that the country is actually two completely separate chunks of land. You've got Peninsular Malaysia on the tip of the Malay Peninsula. It's dangling south from Thailand, kind of like a finger pointing toward the equator. And then way out east, across the open South China Sea, you've got East Malaysia, which is where you'll find Sabah and Sarawak. It's sitting north of the island of Borneo. Put them together, and you're looking at a country that covers about 330,803 square kilometres, or 127,724 square miles. The capital, Kuala Lumpur, is located on the western side of the peninsula. And, interestingly, it's closer to the Indonesian island of Sumatra than to East Malaysia. So there's a separate administrative capital called Putrajaya, south of Kuala Lumpur. And that's where most of the government offices operate. Besides that little quirky detail, what does Malaysia look like? Well, in a word, lush. About 54 to 60% of the country is tropical jungle. In fact, they're some of the oldest rainforests on the planet. And in it, you'll find a forest canopy where the trees regularly hit 45 metres tall. That's about 150 feet, with some monsters pushing it past 90 metres, or 300 feet. Beneath that, there are literally 4 separate layers of vegetation stacked on top of each other, all the way down to the forest floor. So yeah, you could say it's pretty dense. But it's not all forest here, because as you move inland, you'll find mountain ranges, specifically Banjaran Titi Wangsa, peaking at around 7,200 feet, or 2,200 metres before flattening out toward the coasts. Speaking of coast, the western coast is actually where most people live. It's flat, fertile and dotted with ports. The eastern coast, on the other hand, faces the South China Sea. Because of that, it's no stranger to storms. Now, while we're here at the eastern coast, let's sail across the waters to the other side of the country, to East Malaysia. And this is where things get interesting. Sarawak's interior is a triangle of mountain ranges and rainforest. It looks normal at first, until you discover that it's hiding one of the most spectacular cave systems on the planet. It's called the Gunung Mulu National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Inside you'll find the Sarawak Chamber, also known as the largest natural cavern known to man. It measures 600 metres long and 400 metres wide, which is roughly 2,000 by 1,400 feet. Nearby you'll find a deer cave that houses about 1 to 3 million bats. And if you thought our adventure was over, think again, 'cause over at Sabah, there's Mount Kinabalu. It stands at 13,435 feet, or about 4,100 metres. It's the highest peak between the Himalayas and New Guinea, which is honestly a feat all on its own. As for wildlife, Malaysia's got the Malayan gaur, or commonly known as bison, proboscis monkeys, clouded leopards, crocodiles, over 700 to 800 species of birds, and more butterfly species than you can count. So if you're big on biodiversity, Malaysia should definitely be on your bucket list. Good thing I dropped the links to a custom travel planner and VPN in the description below. That way, you can plan your trip without any worries. Oh, another thing you don't need to worry about, Malaysia's economy. It's doing pretty well right now, and honestly, it's better than a lot of people expect. In 2025, the country's GDP grew by 5.2%. Compare that to the global average of 3.3% that same year, it's clear to see that things are looking up for Malaysia. Not only that, but it also looks like it's outperforming most of the world. In fact, in just the final quarter of 2025 alone, its growth hit 6.3%, which was the fastest recorded pace since 2022. So it's only natural to wonder, how? A few things really. For one, manufacturing is huge. The total manufacturing sales hit roughly 1.97 trillion ringgit in 2025, which is nearly $500 billion, with electrical and electronics products leading the charge. Actually, that's not a surprise because Malaysia is a serious player in the global semiconductor supply chain. So, the current tech upcycle is very much working in its favour. Besides manufacturing, services are also a big deal. Retail and wholesale trade hit 1.87 trillion ringgit, or about $474 billion for the full year, which was up 5.6% from 2024. Clearly people are spending, and businesses are investing. So much so that foreign direct investment jumped to 27.8 billion ringgit, or about $7 billion, in the fourth quarter of 2025 alone. Meanwhile, inflation is sitting at a very comfortable 1.6%. Basically, nothing. Unemployment is at 2.9%, which is near historic lows, and the labour force has grown to 17.6 million people. All signs point to stability. And in 2026, the projected GDP is about $439 billion. But it's not completely smooth sailing. US tariffs are a real concern. Malaysia actually got hit with a 25% tax, later negotiated down to 19%, and now there's a 10% global blanket tariff floating around. Apart from that, there's also geopolitical tension in the Middle East that they have to think about, because that means oil prices are going to change. Don't worry though. Right now, Malaysia is facing global uncertainty from a position of strength, and I have no doubt that they will overcome these challenges. Why? Because their culture is the cornerstone of everything they do, and that's their superpower right now. See, the Malays make up the largest ethnic group, practicing Islam and speaking Bahasa Malaysia, which is a language rooted in ancient Austronesian origins. Then you've got the Chinese, making up about a quarter of the population. They, on the other hand, speak Hokkien, Cantonese, or Mandarin, depending on where their ancestors came from. Indians account for about 6 to 7%, and most of them are descendants of Tamil-speaking South Indians who were brought over during the British colonial rule. Beyond these three major groups, you've got dozens of indigenous communities. Take, for example, the Orang Asli on the peninsula, or the Kadazan Dusuns, the Bajus, and the Murut in Sabah. There's also the Iban, Bidayu, and Orang Ulu in Sarawak. Each of them has their own languages, traditions, ways of life. On top of those, these communities retain a lot of their customs, religions, and social circles. But I must say, intermarriage across ethnic lines is pretty rare. Yet, somehow Malaysia doesn't feel fractured at all, more like a place where difference has learned to coexist. A big reason for that is their shared set of values. Family sits at the absolute centre of Malaysian social life, and this includes loyalty, respect for elders, support and teamwork, which are more than ideals to them. In fact, they're practiced on the daily. There's also the concept of face. It's basically this idea that your reputation, dignity, even character are precious, and as such worth protecting. So, across Malay, Chinese and Indian communities, there's that shared understanding that everyone should stay calm and keep the harmony. That way they can avoid any form of public embarrassment. But that really shouldn't be a problem, because as we've established, differences here are embraced, not shunned. And nowhere is that more apparent than with local food and festivals. Obviously these topics deserve a separate video altogether, but I'll give you the gist of it. So Malaysia has a tradition called open house, where during celebrations like Hari Raya, Chinese New Year, or Deepavali, you literally open your home to anyone, be it neighbours, friends, family, or strangers. You all come in, eat and celebrate together. And I know this is mostly a Malaysian tradition, but if you were to participate in the celebration, would you rather be the host or the guest? I'd probably be a guest. That way I can try all the different types of food. How about you? Drop it in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.